Hi everyone, James from AIM. I'm with James Colburn here, who does all of our webinars and is a data coach and avid race driver.
Yeah.
So we're just here and we're going to talk through a few of our key products. So the first one we're going to talk about today is the Formula Steering Wheel 4. So this is something that you've got in.
It is, yep, I just installed this,
seater.
yeah, put it in just a couple of months ago. I actually used it in anger, so to speak, just a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, great. What do you think is, what do you like about it? What's the best bits about it?
So, I mean, I think that there's a load of things that I love about it. I think that for me, it's customization. So in many respects, being able to customize, your dash, your display, being in a position where, if you think about, turning some of these dials that are here, you can adjust what you see on screen a lot easier than you would do being able to press the buttons. Anyone who's used, for example, the Formula Wheel 3 knows that when you're sort of flicking through pages, same if you've got any of the dashes with the little silver buttons on the side. Nice to be able to flick through the pages, but when you're doing 100 plus miles an hour, thinking, have I actually pressed it right, while you're also considering where to brake, where to turn, especially if there are other cars around, makes it difficult. So a lot of the usability is better in terms of being able to just flick through pages and the simple sort of navigation. But for me, the customization allows you to be able to create lots of different dashes. It's obviously a color display, which is really nice to be able to sort of work through. And then there's one other, I think, particularly interesting sort of feature of it as well, is that it's the latest tech. And so recently I did a video on my channel. We've talked about it as part of the AimShop videos as well, which is creating your own reference lap, where you can find sort of your best lap from previous time you've been there, maybe take somebody else's lap, and use that to be able to chase that around the track. Well, to be able to do that in a Formula car, especially using even an Evo 4S, the tech wasn't advanced enough to be able to do so. So the thing I love about this is it's the very latest technology, so all the features, all the functionality which is coming out with the software complement the hardware, so they work particularly well. So that's that. I mean, in a nutshell, there's some of the sort of key features that I love.
Yeah, I mean, I've just from using it downstairs on the simulator, I mean, I don't do much racing myself, but I've used it quite a lot on the simulator, and what I quite liked was almost some of the logic behind, obviously, the messages and how you can program it. So, for example, you could have this set of buttons do, for example, here we've got them for lights, we've got them for neutral, pit, and obviously depending on where you have these rotaries, and this is because the wheel's all a complete CAN bus system, so everything's configurable. So what I quite liked when I was using it on a simulator is how you could almost put it in a different mode here. Obviously you can change the display and all sorts of different things, but also you can actually change the logic for what these buttons do depending on where that mode is. So I know there's a customer of ours that's actually got like a diagnostics screen and display. It's a small OEM manufacturer where they've actually got this, for example, say dial 1's in dial 4, dial 2 and then dial 6, and you have to press this button, it brings up a diagnostics display. So there's lots of like so much complex hidden tech. It can be as simple as you want, but it can also be as complex as you want.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's brilliant about this new technology, how everything's CAN bus, everything, how it works inside, internally. You can really do whatever you want. The stuff's endless that you can do with
Yeah,
it.
totally. And I think one of the things that is really interesting with devices like this is the universal applicability across vehicles. When I was putting it in a Formula Ford, now remember, they sort of Formula Fords are 30, 40-year-old technology in some instances. When you think about the engine, you're not looking at any ECU, you have to work with channels, and oftentimes when you think about the more modern day technology, which has all of the signals and the data being gathered within the engine management system of the car, which you can then feed into the system, the question is new technology still applicable in older vehicles? And what I found with the Formula Ford is that the answer is yes, but there are going to be elements that you want to be able to use all of the buttons, you want to be able to use all sorts of different sort of variables there. So for me, the ability to be able to still bring in all of the channels, I have all the data that I need, same data that I had previously in older system in the vehicle, but then to be able to customize some of these things. To give you a simple example, engine management, no over rev protection as an example, being able to have warnings on different buttons to be able to say this is an over rev, it flashes different colors, you can customize it without it being intrusive, is a nice feature as well. Because one of the challenges you also have, and I'm sure many people who've set up alarms have got this, is that you set up an alarm, you don't get your conditions just right, and for the remainder of the race, all you've got across the front of the screen is over rev alarm, and you can't remember which button to be able to turn it off. To have the option of just having that as a button, which just reminds you, I actually have mine coloured purple, which is a colour I'd never use anywhere else, just to be able to remind me to keep an eye on it, to check the data afterwards, is an important component. So the more you have here, the more flexibility you have in terms of being able to customise it for yourself. And arguably, it works with old and new machinery, which I think is also fantastic.
I think, didn't you have you had the wheel before this, didn't you? You had the Formula Steering Wheel 3.
Yep.
And obviously we used to have an Evo 4S. So before we used to have an Evo 4S and the Formula Steering Wheel 3 that all come together. So how do you now, with this wheel, how do you get all of your analog inputs from your Formula Ford? How does that come into the wheel now?
Great question, and this is a question I got when I installed it in the vehicle as well. Everything's in the wheel now, so there's no need for the 4S. And I think when I was talking to the team as they were putting in the new wheel and we were taking out the 4S, it was a different sort of mindset, which is the wheel is no longer just a display unit for the logger. The wheel is the logger and the display unit together. What it does mean, however, is that you have to think through how you work with channel expansion, how you work with making sure all of your inputs are sort of feeding into effectively what is the AIM CAN, the first stream that comes in from all of the AIM devices, so to speak, and all the AIM channels that is there. So one of the things that we set up at the beginning was almost like a schema, which was a map that I drew, which basically said, ultimately the one, and maybe we can sort of put it on screen or something, I can say what we did. But basically, at one point, you want everything to feed into one feed that goes into the wheel. And so as a result, you've got to then work that backwards to say, then I've got to get back to a data hub. From a data hub, I have to have the channel expansions, which feed into the data hub. Sounds complicated, but ultimately it's just a case of sort of relaying things together. And then from each of those channels, you would say, okay, this one represents brake pressure. I have front and rear brake pressure. Beautifully now on the screen, I could put in there elements of bias, so I can adjust the bias in the car and understand what's happening on the screen, all the way through to oil pressure, oil temp, water temp, all the things that allow me to set up the alarms that are on here as well. And it also then freed up, and this is where you can go beyond necessarily some of the 4S type technology, and anyone who's now working with maybe more modern machinery, is a lot of opportunities to bring in additional sort of inputs that come in through CAN streams or through the ECU. So, tire pressure monitoring system, for example, that comes in through an ECU channel. You can set it up on ECU2, for example. There could be other inputs you want to bring in, which all can then feed into how you want to configure and customize, your setup. And so for me, it was make sure you've got your channels right, make sure they feed into that one feed that feeds into the wheel, which is what we did. And so in the end it worked out, but it was a bit of planning up front. But if anyone is interested in terms of how we did it, we can share that, because once it's done once, I think everyone can sort of follow that particular model.
Yeah, no, I forgot about the schematics that you showed me. So yeah, that would be wicked. We'll put that on the video. Also, what about, obviously you don't have paddle shifting in the Formula 4, do you? So obviously I'll just show here. So on the back here, we've just got on this one, we've got the paddle shift on the back, but obviously you can also have hand clutch on here, so you can have on both sides here. You've got the option for hand clutch either side. You can have both paddles, and you could use one of them for a potentiometer, for a switch, for something. You could use it for whatever you want. It doesn't have to be a hand clutch. You could use them as, I don't know, anything really. It's just a potentiometer and a sensor, and that can send a signal out. And for example, you had it connected up with a PDM, it could be used with the PDM. So I think that's when a lot of the logic inside the wheel here can be really beneficial, is when you start using something like this with a power distribution module. Like we spoke about using a little micro PDM, didn't we, with your car. I think when you start incorporating all this push button logic for PDM functionality, it then becomes a phenomenal device.
I totally agree, and I think that it's having driven cars that are paddle shift as well, powered by AIM systems too. The beauty of having it on the wheel with the paddle is that customized experience that you didn't get with Formula Wheel 3, the previous version. Here you can have much simpler displays. You can sort of integrate gear changes, have it displayed on the screen. It just helps with making sure that you're always in the right gear or whatever the particular variable need be. But I also think, sort of leaning on that PDM aspect as well, there have been a lot more conversations lately about people sort of with older vehicles. I'm not necessarily thinking Formula Ford in this instance, but I've heard it with people with older Mazda Miatas or MX-5, depending on where you are and you're watching this particular video, where they've sort of gone out and invested in a sort of a micro PDM that may do just simple things like may switch on cooling fans, it may switch on rain lights, something that you can potentially integrate so that instead of the button really sort of representing data coming in from the feed, you can then send sort of instructions out. Great example here would be rev limiter. So if you wanted to be able to sort of, I think we've even got it on the dash somewhere here, one of these is pit variable that's here. Just each of these to be able to work through, which for someone like me who's worked with AIM stuff for 10 years, this feels like another world, but is attainable, and it's something that is potentially within all of our grasp.
No, that's really interesting. Really interesting. No, okay. Is there anything else you think you use the wheel for? I mean, what about the graphical display? How would you set up the display? Obviously, we do this wheel in multiple different sizes. So this is the 270. We do the 280. We then it jumps to the 320 and the 350. Obviously, the good thing about the 320 and the 350 is the screen's slightly bigger. But obviously, I think you mentioned, obviously, with this, it was quite important to set the displays up in a certain way so that you could see everything, didn't you? So
definitely.
You struggled sometimes with the smaller text, with that, or is that maybe just with the glasses and things like that?
Well, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that out loud because people are on track with me as well. And being able to say I can't see the screen on my wheel is quite unnerving. But in reality, that's true. Depending on the size of the wheel you get, the custom setup and the different. Anyone who's using a dash, for example, has worked through some of the larger sort of MXGs all the way through to the smaller ones, like an MXS. You start understanding that there are certain key variables that you can't put on screen, and even though there is a template that allows you to put multiple variables on the dash itself, you don't want something in size 12 font that you have to hunt for when, as we've talked about, you're trying to navigate the track, you're trying to navigate a race. So it's really finding that comfortable balance in terms of the setup and the configuration that works for you, to be able to say, and you know, as one of the default setups that exists within Race Studio 3 to set up the dash layout, you have it's called a rally configuration, but I don't think it should just be for rally. It's a beautiful display with much bigger text, not for sort of like people like me who need bigger text. You know, I do still wear my glasses in the car, or contacts I should say. But in many respects it means that you can still sort of really focus on what you need. Now, what I will say is that by being able to toggle through different screens, I can share with you actually a video of I've videoed me sort of, you know, toggling through the screen, so hopefully it'll be shared as part of this to overlay. Yeah. You can see that there are different variables, because the thing that we've got to think about is that you're not always looking at the screen when you're on track. If, for example, you're engineering your car, if you're somebody who is, you know, setting it up, warming it up at the beginning of the day, understanding everything that's there, you can have different variables to be able to see. And so, you know, you could have a page which is just a diagnostics page, which is 3 clicks of one of the rotary dials that has all of your variables there, that would only ever be used if the car is potentially sitting in the pit, you know, being worked on or being maintained. And so, you know, think about the dash as not being something that you only see on track, but when you are on track, make sure you have effectively the minimum amount of information that you need to effectively get through the race, because all the other data can be downloaded later. And more importantly, why would you have your water temperature on the screen if you had an alarm set up that warned you if the water temperature were too high? Yeah. If the water temperature doesn't go too high, you don't need to know, just carry on racing. And so finding that comfortable balance based on the size of the screen is important. Here's another thing which I also love. In the more modern tech, the shift light doesn't have to be a shift light. Not many people actually use this function, and it rolls all the way through to the sort of like the AIM Solo 2s, all the way through now to this sort of technology. You can change the shift light to not necessarily represent RPMs, but how you're doing on a predictive lap. And so if for qualifying, for example, you had a tachometer in the middle of the screen that just told you your revs, and instead you had lights across the top that gave you a representation of how much better or worse you're doing on that lap, that could be just a quick glance down at the screen to say, well, I've lit, you know, 4 or 5 of these green bars, each represents, you know, 1/10 of a second. I'm half a second up on this lap. And so there's different ways that you can work through this that previously were unavailable in the older technology. So a nice way of being able to look at it for whatever preference you have.
No, that's good. just on your alarm comment, I mean, just I know from a few other people that I've spoke to and customers and stuff, when they mention, when we say about alarms, a lot of people say, oh, is it just like a little LED? And they go, oh, what if I don't see the LED? But obviously with our stuff, you can program the whole display to become alarm. So if you, for example, the oil pressure was too low or the water temperature was too high, you can make the whole screen just turn red with oil pressure or red with water temperature. So there's a massive benefit, and like you were saying, there's no point having that information unless you need to, unless there's a problem. But then obviously if there is a problem, we can make it so visible and so in your face that you're not going to drive around with no oil pressure or high water temperature or whatever it may be. I think that's a massive, from a safety point of view, for obviously the engine and the running of the vehicle. That's really good as well.
Oh, totally. And then that's been one of the, the real step up, I would say, in the last 5 or 10 years with AIM dashes, with AIM devices, is that to be able to have, the distracting, and it sounds strange, why do I want to be distracted in a race car? The only time you want to be distracted by your car's engine when you're in a race car is when the car potentially won't make it back to the pits, or you want to save the engine. And so doing so by being able to have that screen red is what we've done all the way through, from anyone who's had the MXL2, which I must say probably 10 years old at least now,
it's getting on,
all the way through to these sort of tech, by just right in your face. That's when you need to pay attention, I think, in that instance. And so yeah, absolutely, big plus in terms of being able to set that up.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. I think there's anything else you want to talk about with the wheel? I think that's...
No, it's lovely. I mean, a lot of people ask me, is it overkill in a Formula Ford? And I think that for me, as a data person, as a sort of a data enthusiast, no. But there are moments when you want the buttons to be able to do more, but then, that's at the discretion of what you want. The nice thing is, however, is that all of these are coloured right now. They all come with different coloured templates and variables, so they could be all one colour. You can light them all up so they're less distracting. And so, yeah, I think that when people say, well, what are all the buttons for, and do you have a way of being able to use them? Well, you can still use them for configuration, for lights, for all sorts of stuff. And so, for me, when you think about the cost and the expense of an Evo 4S plus the wheel, now all baked into one device instead, arguably at that point, you're in a sort of like, well, I could do it this way, I could do it this way. But in this particular model, I've got all of these new tech, new features, new enhancements. So I think it's worthwhile being able to have a look at, even if you've got an older vehicle. Yeah, and I think just on that topic is obviously, like you said, about mounting it into it. Is it, for example, obviously what we're quite, and what you race, and there's a lot of our equipment in the Formula Ford series and stuff like that. There's a lot of our stuff in single seaters. But for example, in a Formula Ford, like you said, some people might say, is it overkill? Well, obviously the beauty of our stuff is you might not always race Formula Ford. Yes.
You might go and do 2 years in Formula Ford and then look to go and do something else. And obviously the beauty of our stuff is you can just take that with you. You could take it out of the car, especially with this, is with the harness.
Yep.
So this is the harness that you have with the wheel, and this is obviously what you would wire into the car. So this is the bit that you'd have all wired into all the different bits of the car, and then you've sort of got your dash connector here that would sort of sit on the dashboard. And that's what the wheel would then plug into. So worst case scenario, said okay, I don't want to rip all the wiring out. You could just buy another one of these at £150, which is the bit that's all wired into the car. Buy another one and put it into another vehicle.
Absolutely.
And obviously it lasts for years and years.
Definitely.
So yeah.
I have to say I'm impressed. I was excited to see how it was. We just showed a little bit when we were at the NEC in Birmingham this year, and every device I think just has one small feature that you absolutely love. And for me, apart from the fact that I've got all the personal configuration, everything I need, for me it's these turning dials in any kind of car. To be able to quickly navigate without looking, knowing a click here, the dash changes to what you're looking for. That's amazing. And I'll give you a case in point. One of the screens that I have set up on mine is for tyre information, and I have a tyre pressure monitoring system in the vehicle. And when you're in a position in the previous sort of dash, and I could do this in the previous dash as well, but it was a lot harder to be able to find, I actually got a puncture. I got a puncture at Brands Hatch, in fact, going through clearways, and the car started to behave in a strange particular manner. And at that point, the question that is, well, what's going on? Is there a failure in sort of some kind of suspension component? What's going on? To be able to flick through and see one of your wheels very quickly is down at sort of 5 or 10 psi lower than all the others is a nice way to be able to just understand and navigate. But oftentimes getting to that page in the panic of going, what the hell's going on with my car, to just be able to turn that dial is nice. So I've got that set up to be able to ensure that I can diagnose a problem very quickly if I need to. And so for me, that's a huge feature that I love, beyond everything else that's there.
Yeah, for me, I think that they're a really high quality rotary as well. You've got a very affirmative switch on the rotary, haven't you? You're not going to turn it too far or not enough. There's a real. It's not too hard to turn, but you're moving it a mode, don't you?
Yeah.
So when you've got your gloves on and when you're concentrating, you haven't got to worry that you're going to spin it 3 modes and turn. For example, if you're using it for traction control in another vehicle, you're not going to accidentally turn the traction completely off. It is a nice affirmative switch on the rotary, which
Totally.
I quite like.
Yeah, I love that. Love that.
So, yeah, okay, that's great. Well, if any of you want to know anything more about, obviously, any of our products, but obviously we're talking about the wheel here, you can go and see everything online at aimshop.com. Our phone number's there. We've got a live chat with all of our technicians and everything like that. So, if it's a technical question or a sales question, whatever it may be, just go to aimshop.com and you can speak to one of our guys there, and they'll be able to answer any questions and guide you through the process of purchasing one of these lovely wheels.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Thank you.
No worries.